This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Mara Donnelly, my co-host, is on special assignment, and this week we're going to have a special edition of Behind the Headlines, something that we've been wanting to do for some time. We have so many individuals in Pennsylvania that are highly knowledgeable and steeped in the tradition and the development of radio, and we would like to talk about some of these alternative media. And radio is certainly one that's so rich in history. I don't know about you, our viewers, but as I grew up, I remember smuggling a radio to bed with me in the evenings so I could listen to Cousin Brucey from WABC, New York, and listening to the adventures of the Lone Ranger and Sherlock Holmes and Orson Welles as the Shadow. Truly, it was the theater of the mind, is the theater of the mind, and radio continues to play an important role in media today. And we'd like to tap into some of the expertise of some of the people who live in Pennsylvania and some of the people that are available. We are lucky enough to have with us today two of these individuals. First, we have Tony Romeo. Tony, welcome to the show. Tony, you are the radio correspondent for KYW Philadelphia and KDKA Pittsburgh in the state capital in Harrisburg. Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and been involved with radio for essentially your entire life.
Pretty much.
Okay, and we also have Bill Kauffman. Now, Bill was a radio personality in the 1950s, and then he was a master
control operator
for television, and works with WGAL TV Channel 8 in Lancaster, and still has some irons in the fire with internet radio, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So let's start out with the development of radio. This is something that I teach in my classes, Tony. When we talk about mass media and we get to the age of electronic media, we start with 1920 with the development of radio, and the first commercial radio station goes on the air during the presidential election of November 1920, I guess, when Warren G. Harding was running. I remember it so well. And it was KDKA in Pittsburgh. One would suspect that the first radio station would have come out of New York or Chicago or Boston, but it came out of Pittsburgh of all places. What led to KDKA being the first commercial station, Tony?
Well, I think what happened was that the history of radio is that it evolved. The first radio broadcasts were Morse code only. The technology that allowed for voice and sounds to be transmitted came along later. And for the beginning, radio was considered to be a two-way public safety back and forth conversation medium, and the notion of creating programs that would be sent in one direction to be listened to only sort of evolved and developed over time. I think that there was evidence that there were some amateur people doing that for a while, and then KDKA came along in November of 1920, and actually put a formal broadcast on the air to report those election returns. And then going forward, laid claim to being the first commercial radio station, in part because of George Westinghouse, who was the principal of the mighty Westinghouse Corporation. A lot of early radio broadcasters were associated with, in many cases, for example, retailers. In other words, the idea of advertising came along later, and many of the first radio stations that were put on the air were put on by people because they wanted to sell radios. RCA, for example, and NBC. The idea was to give people something to listen to so they'd buy radios. It wasn't advertising right away. That came along kind of later. And so in Westinghouse's case, his businesses and his fortune were linked heavily to electronics, so he wanted that cachet of being involved in broadcasting at the forefront of technology, of electronic technology.
I can't imagine, though, it's hard to imagine sitting there listening to a radio transmission of Morse code. I guess one would have to be fairly adroit in translating it or decoding it. I guess is the appropriate term. Do you know Morse code?
Actually, I had an amateur radio license a long time ago, and I did actually have a very, very basic fundamental ability to communicate Morse code, but unfortunately I did not keep up with it, and I couldn't do it today.
What kind of material would be transmitted?
Well, people, back, of course, Morse code was the same code that was used to communicate by telegraph, and there are people who can do that almost 100 or more than 100 words a minute. I mean, it's like anything else. If you practice it enough, you can do it almost like speaking. And of course, there were telegraph operators that was what they did for a living, and ships at sea had radio telegraph operators to transmit, some cases, messages. In fact, not to get off the rails, but on the night of the Titanic sank, one of the reasons that emergency messages were not heeded is because the telegraph operator was too busy sending personal messages from passengers back home.
Oh my goodness.
By Morse code.
Well, I know, and it did change. It must have changed by 1910. I understand that Lee DeForest broadcasted Enrico Caruso from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. So I guess it had moved far enough by that time to transmit some live
DeForest was the
voice.
fellow who invented the audion, as he called it, which allowed for the transmission of voices and sounds, and the radio medium that we know today.
Now, it's 2 more years, as I understand, and either one of you jump in. WWJ in Detroit is the second commercial broadcasting station that I know of. Why did it take 2 years, Bill, for a second station to come online? I would have thought that it might have happened more quickly. Was it just the sort of waiting for the public to catch up?
I would imagine
with the technology?
Demand issue, most likely.
Okay. Yeah.
And some of this is hazy. I think some of this is hazy because, as I said, you have people who were doing this, who were making radio transmissions. Some were amateurs, and some were doing it in the idea that it's not like somebody woke up one day and said, "Hey," not like Marconi showed up one day at a corporate board office and said, "Here's this radio, and we can send programs and make money by advertising." It all sort of evolved, and a lot of things happened sort of informally before it became formalized.
And we both consider Marconi the father of the radio?
To the extent that he was the first one to practically demonstrate that there were electromagnetic waves and use them, yes. Okay. But he didn't really invent radio as we know it today.
Okay. And by the 1950s, what interested you, Bill, to enter radio? First of all, was it listening to it as a young person,
No,
or
believe it or not, no, it was my brother.
What happened
My
with
brother,
your brother?
My brother was the chief engineer of Channel 15,
television station
after
in Lebanon,
yes.
Lancaster,
and WLBR was the name that was given at the time, but it was changed to WLYH, and so in 1958 he assumed chief engineership there. And I was like 14 years old, and he would let me actually switch the brakes, and from then on I knew what I wanted to do for a living.
Ah, so it was a family member that got you
Yes,
involved.
both technically and the announcing end too.
Oh, okay. Tony, what got you interested? What happened
like
to interest you in radio?
I would sneak the radio to bed with me at night and
Listen to my show.
listen to actually, Dr. Bill would probably not want me to tell people about being in 7th or 8th grade and listening to read the school lunch menus for Palmyra, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. Yes, Dr. Bill was one of my radio heroes.
Is that the name that you used on the radio?
I used that at WAHT at Lebanon. I had been at a total of about 15 or 16 stations up and down the coast, so I've been around a while.
Okay. Now, when KDKA went on the air in WWJ, they went on as AM stations. When did FM come around, and how did FM diverge from AM?
Well, I would like to just say that
Sure.
I worked in FM when everybody else was listening to AM. I worked in Chicago at a place called WCLM, and they had a unique ID. Their ID went something like this. This is FM for everyone, WCLM Chicago at 101.9, broadcasting from the site of Fort Dearborn with a power of 50,000 watts and serving you 24 hours a day. And nobody was listening.
Oh, no.
That was 1964.
Oh, my goodness.
But there was a changeover to FM.
Well, yeah, I mean, FM was invented not really that long after AM by Colonel Armstrong, one of the, along with DeForest and others, and Marconi, one of the key figures, pivotal figures in the development of the technology.
Edwin Armstrong.
Yes.
Okay.
And I believe his rank was colonel. These guys had all, like General David Sarnoff, the founder of NBC, had been, had been in the military service, although not in combat. And they had been given these ranks. But anyway, Armstrong invented FM, and it took a long time for FM to take hold, I think, just because AM was dominant first. And I don't know, my own theory is, my belief is that FM did not become a real factor until the mid-'70s, when cars started being manufactured with FM radios as standard equipment. Before the mid-'70s, if you wanted FM on an FM radio, you had to order it special. If you didn't, your car came with an AM radio. And it was after that point that music audiences began to migrate from AM to FM. But FM was around for a long time.
Well, what is the technical difference, guys, between AM and FM? There must be...
The form of modulation.
Okay.
AM is amplitude modulation, where the amplitude changes and the frequency remains.
And what does that mean for laymen like myself?
I don't know.
Well, what it means is AM modulates the power of the signal.
Okay.
Your radio is detecting changes in the power. FM is detecting changes in the frequency. As a practical matter, what that means is that AM is much more susceptible to interference from power sources, like a poorly grounded light circuit or lightning or an overhead power line, which is why you get that hum or bursts of static on AM that you don't get on FM.
So that's why some consider FM to be a better venue to listen to music.
The other reason is something called frequency response. FM has better frequency response. It reproduces sounds much more fully and lushly, but that is also a function of AM is capable of doing that theoretically. The reason AM doesn't do that has more to do with the fact that the way the AM band was constructed, the bandwidths are narrower, and they're not able. AM radio stations aren't, in many cases, able to send the same full range of frequencies, and AM, more importantly, AM receivers aren't constructed to receive and reproduce those frequencies. So AM people perceive as a tinnier sound when it comes to, although it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, it just kind of is.
Okay, well, we're just warming up here. We have a lot more ground to cover. We'll be right back with the second half of the program right after this. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. On the second half of the program, which we are filming, by the way, on location at FM
for Everyone.
FM for Everyone, on location at the
Kauffman Creative Services Incorporated.
Kauffman Creative, and we appreciate the ability to come here and to film on location with you and Tony and all the material. I want to thank you very much, Bill.
Pleasure.
We were talking a little bit about the development of radio, and we see that goodness, when television comes around in the early 1950s and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, we find that radio starts to fall a little bit by the wayside. It doesn't seem to continue to be developed the way it was in Britain with the BBC, or Canada with the CBC, or even the broadcasting done in Australia. What was that like, Tony, the competition between radio and television for listeners and viewers?
Well, I mean, what happened basically, of course, was that radio lost its stars when television came along. Jack Benny's and people like that all went to television. And radio had to reinvent itself, which it did very successfully. Probably the most significant figure in that regard is a fellow named Gordon McClendon, who owned radio stations. It was an entrepreneur, raconteur in the Texas and Midwest and Western Mountain West areas of the state, of the country. And he's basically the guy who invented Top 40 radio, which took the country by storm in the late 50s and early 60s. The first really big Top 40 station was recognized as KLIF in Dallas, which was a McClendon station, which was the, again, I'll try to make this as brief as possible. A story, which is maybe apocryphal, it's not documented, but the story goes that guys like McClendon and guys who had been in radio before, who owned these radio stations, didn't know what to do with them, were all sitting around one night drinking beer in a bar, I guess, and they were trying to figure out what to do with their radio stations, and slowly they began to realize that as people went up to the jukebox, there were 100 songs in the jukebox, but that people were playing the same 20 or 25 songs, and on top of that, they were playing the same 3 or 4 songs even more often, and they said, hey, what if we program a radio station like this? And then Top 40 Radio was born.
Well, in 1950, I have a statistic here. In 1950, in America, there were 90 million radio sets and only 10 million TVs. Times have changed, I guess. And Bill, you had to make the decision, but you entered radio first, yes, and then you made the transition to TV later. I remember, as I said, growing up with listening to WHP 580 AM in Harrisburg, and one of the most colorful radio personalities in Pennsylvania, I think at the time, until the day he retired, and his longevity spanned decades, was a gentleman by the name of Ron Drake. Can you tell us a little bit about
Ron Drake? Yeah, we'll mark you down
Drake?
that way. That's the way he talked to you. He had a distinctive style.
Don't forget the rubber duck.
Squeak, squeak, squeak. Yes, I ended up being the main fill-in for Ron Drake in the early and mid-'70s. And he was quite unusual in the fact he didn't like to have people in the studio when he was broadcasting. And I was one of the few that was blessed to be there when he was actually there. And sometimes I would, like on April 1st of some years, they wouldn't let him on because of some of the stunts that he had done, like the submarines on the Susquehanna River and some other stunts. So I would work April 1st, and I would talk just like him. And some people couldn't tell the difference in those days. I don't think I could do it anymore.
I remember the one stunt where he said that the Queen Mary was coming to Harrisburg,
Very
and
good,
everyone
yes.
should go down to the
Right.
South Street Bridge to welcome the Queen Mary. And of course, Susquehanna River, you're lucky if you can get a raft of some parts of it.
And
But
so they
there
did.
were people
bet.
that showed up and that just trusted what they were hearing on the radio. And as he grew close to retirement, he would pull different pranks or certain stunts, like he put a 1-ton block of ice in the Colonial Park Shopping Center in Harrisburg, and people had a chance, I guess, to win a car if you were the person who guessed correctly when the last bit of ice melted. I don't know, how did he think these things up, Bill?
I don't know. I don't know, but I can tell you this, where his jokes came from. He read every newspaper there was, New York Times, he would read the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. That's where he got all of his material. He would cut the little pieces out of the jokes. He would stick them in one of those 7-inch by 7-inch record boxes they used to have, and he would just go like this. He'd just pull them right out, except for the topical humor, which came right out of the newspaper.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
I hope that's not telling too much of a secret.
No, and now the internet has replaced all that, I guess.
Yes, I think it has.
And now I guess, Tony, while people are on the radio live, they are on their computers at the same time looking for material as they are broadcasting. Isn't that true?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, it's the internet age that we live in. Everything's at your fingertips.
Well, we've come to a new era, actually, as electronic media has grown. Well, one thing that we don't want to skip over is as FM became more and more prominent, there were some people that thought AM would just disappear altogether. And then there are some people who will actually give Rush Limbaugh credit for saving AM radio, or at least give credit to talk radio for saving the AM band. Do you both look upon it that way or not? Do you think talk radio saved AM radio or not?
Well, yeah, it had to, because FM took away the music audiences, and again, AM, once more after television came along, and then once again had to reinvent itself, and not just political talk or issue-oriented talk, but sports radio, talk radio is very big. What really changed the landscape in the late '80s with Rush Limbaugh and others was syndication. When you had personalities that were big enough and successful enough that it changed the economics for local stations to do talk. Talk, of course, before that was, without syndication, was extremely expensive. Now you had basically the building blocks of these syndicated personalities, and most of the successful talk stations in the country, local stations, have one or two local hosts, and then the rest of the day is then built out with syndicated programming.
Mm-hmm. Now, as technology continued to evolve, then we've entered into the area of satellite radio. And I mentioned Cousin Brucey. Well, I, in the early 1960s, may have been going to bed in the evening trying to catch a listen to Cousin Brucey's program from WABC New York, where he was talking about Palisades Park and advertising it. It's interesting, on satellite radio, he lives again. He is broadcasting every weekend on satellite radio. What can you tell us about the evolution or the development of satellite radio, Bill?
I can tell you a little bit about Dan Ingram and Cousin Brucey. I met them.
Oh, my goodness.
A friend of mine, Jim Carr, was their engineer, and I spent an afternoon with them.
What were they like?
They were great folks. Dan Ingram would just put his feet up on the desk and get his voiceover things on the phone. He did a lot of voiceovers. A lot of that show was done completely by the engineer. He would sit directly across from him. There was no window in between. And each show had its own style of how it would play. Like when Cousin Brucey came in at 6, things would change totally in the studio.
How so?
It was a different atmosphere. He did a different show. He played the same music, the same jingles, but he had a different style and demanded the way the cards were played, the way the music was played.
Well, I'm listening to Cousin Brucey now on satellite radio, and he plays songs from the 1960s
Right.
that I never heard of or don't remember. I don't even know, where does he get this material?
I don't know. Maybe it's requested or over the internet. That's what people request, so that's what they play.
I mean, I was very, very surprised to hear all these songs that he plays currently from that era that my friends or myself, we had never heard before, as we talk a little bit about this. Well, satellite radio got going because of what, to get rid of commercials?
I would think. I like XM. I don't care for AM or FM radio right now. I don't know how that'll play, but I really don't. I like XM radio. That's all I listen to.
Of course, there were two competitors, and
Sirius XM.
Sirius and
Sure.
XM, and now they've merged, right? What happened that resulted in a merger?
Well, I didn't care for it because I liked XM radio the way it was, and I don't care for Sirius, but I'm stuck with it now.
Okay.
I don't know what did happen. Do you know?
It's still evolving.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, in the last 3 minutes of the show, we want to talk now a little bit. We've gone a step further. We've gone to internet radio. And internet radio is varied and still evolving and pretty exciting. Now, both of you are familiar with it. And Bill, you actually have a radio station on internet radio, as we do. We have, of course, Voice of PA as an internet radio station. Yours is FM forever.
The doctor is operating. It's Dr. Bill Kauffman and FM for everyone.
You want to talk a little bit about how you got into this and what you try to do?
Well, I view it as the new frontier. we're the cowboys of radio, because we can do whatever we want. We can announce whatever we want, whatever music you want. There are 10,000 radio stations on Live 365, which is the server that FM for Everyone uses. Mm-hmm. And there are something like 300 genres that you can buy into. So there's something for everybody, believe me, because of the diversity of what goes on there. We do 50s and 60s.
Now, you pay royalties, I imagine.
Yes, we do. And that's included in your fee for the Live 365.
Okay. How does how do our viewers go about finding the stations that they might like to listen to?
It's a matter of friend, tell a friend, tell a friend, most likely, from Facebook, from Twitter, and you can pass it on that way. You could actually, if you wanted to, I suppose you could advertise in the newspaper, on TV, but this is not a commercial venture. This is pure love.
But your server again is what?
A Live 365.
So if one would go to Live 365 on the
Live365.com, and then all of the genres will be listed.
So
all
that's
10,000.
a good way. Oh wow, that's a good way to find it.
What's your genre?
50s and 60s.
50s and 60s rock music.
Yes.
Okay, but you can find opera there?
Oh, anything. You can find spoken word, old radio shows, everything.
Very interesting. Now, how long will you continue to be on
This is going to be my retirement project when I finally retire in a couple of years.
Okay, and you conceive of doing it
forever.
Oh.
Goes on forever.
Mm-hmm. Tony, are you what is KYW and KDKA? Are they doing anything with internet radio at this point?
Well, yeah, we have an internet presence where audio is streamed on the internet. Our content is rewritten and appears in print form on the internet. But I don't believe terrestrial radio is ever going to go away.
I guess the internet radio has an advantage in that it's available. If you're in Germany, you can listen to WHP radio.
That's right,
or you
around
can
the
listen
world.
To KYW when you're in Japan, for example. So I guess that's one of the advantages of it.
But I still believe that people are going to want to be able to go to their kitchen cupboard and turn on the radio, and as long as radio remains local and relevant, terrestrial radio will be fine, I believe.
Well, in the last, I'll give you each 15 seconds. What's the future, 20 seconds, what's the future of radio going to be? But you first, Tony.
Live and local. Again, if you talk to them, you tell them what's going on in their world, they'll be there.
I predict we're going the internet route, and I think it will go away.
Oh, really?
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, we have we have a divergence of views here. Well, it's always been the theater of the mind. It will continue to be the theater of the mind. I find it to be much more fascinating than television in some ways. It's going to be an unfolding drama to see what occurs in the next few years. Well, we thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to you joining us again next week. We'll see you then. Thanks again.